Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. This week, we take on one of our periodic dives into the many questions and comments you've shared with us in previous weeks. On this episode, we address everything from books and films to gallantry awards and many other topics in between. Well, hi Dan, pleasure to be joining you again for one of our occasional, periodic question and answer episodes, which are always great fun to do, always quite challenging, I think, for us as hosts, as a lot of these questions we select and we haven't really prepared answers for, but I think the fact we get so many questions and they're so interesting is one of the real highlights of the whole podcast experience. And I know they're one of your favourite episodes to record as well.
Hi, Spence. Yeah, always. Just something about them I really enjoy. I quite like the challenge about it, actually. It's interesting to have a subject and know ahead of time that you're going to cover that. But to just dip in, grab questions, not plan them and think, okay, well, what comes out, and we'll see if it makes any sense in the edit. Hopefully it does. I really enjoy them for one anyway. So big thank you to you guys that have taken time, as always, to send in questions, and do please keep them coming. Just want to make an extra special thanks as well to those that have submitted questions via the Dugout. So our side project, which is related to this, where we've got a number of members that have come along and joined us, and you can get extra content and engage with other audience members. Some really fun stuff going on over there. So do check it out if you haven't already. In fact, I want to shout out very quickly before we start people who have joined at the general tier, which is really impressive. So joined us and supporting us at the highest tier possible, general. In particular, we've got NPR from the USA. We've got TM from California in the USA. We've got Brian Young from Michigan as well. So big thank you to you guys that have come along, joined us, and are supporting us. It's so important to help us keep going with projects like this. So thanks very much indeed. Now, Spence, let's get straight into it then. Of course, many different subjects and questions to address in this one. So, one of the things that's been really popular over the Dugout this last week, I think actually you kicked this off, was asking people what their favourite books about the Great War were. And I thought that might be quite an interesting subject to cover right here on the podcast. So tell us, what are your favourite books or type of books, if you like, related to the Great War?
Oh, great question, Dan. And as I sit here, I'm actually in my own office and I'm just casting a glance over. I've got lucky enough to have multiple bookshelves purely of First World War books. And narrowing them down to say, well, what is my favourite is really challenging. But I love memoirs of the First World War, and I love novels that were written soon after the First World War. They capture, I think, a mood and an image and a memory of the war that we've often forgotten. So as well as all the wonderful history books that are produced, memoirs really catch my mind. And almost impossible for me to pick out an individual favourite, but a memoir I come back to time and time again and enjoy is Frank Richards' Old Soldiers Never Die. He was a pre-war professional. He was in the reserve when the war broke out in 1914, went to war with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, survived the entire war, and then in the late 20s and the early 30s, he actually would write his memoir from memory, actually. He had a phenomenal memory by all accounts. He shared it with Robert Graves, who'd been an officer in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and author, of course, of Goodbye to All That, who edited part of it and actually took some of the royalties of it as well. But I think Old Soldiers Never Die is just such a great window into the pre-war professional soldier. And Frank Richards is not politically correct by today's standards. He's got extremely rude things to say about the Indian army, and he didn't enjoy his experience in India. He's got rude things to say about the French, rude things to say about the Germans. His vision of the war is very much from a gritty, tough private soldier, but one who's got a great eye for detail and a great sense of humour too. And it's one of the few memoirs, I think, of the First World War where you can go from one page where, almost your toes curl at the description of action, to a few pages later, you're actually laughing out loud because of some of his wry observations about the ridiculousness of certain aspects of military life. I just think it's a great book, and it's one that repays revisiting. So is it my favourite book? Well, I don't want to be pinned down on a favourite book, but I might say it's my favourite book at the moment. What about you, Dan? What's on your reading list?
Do you know, if I'm being totally honest, I'm going to be absolutely boring and say exactly the same book. It's probably my very favorite. I like you, I really enjoy these memoirs. And I've actually got into something fairly recently, and it was really due to doing a very deep dive on the story of the Hertfordshire Regiment, my kind of local unit that I really have traversed the Great War with, really, since I started this subject. What I found particularly interesting in that is a number of unpublished books. And it's really guys that have lived into their 70s and 80s that then finally sit down and think, do you know what, I better write something about this, even if it's only to create 10 copies, which are going to go to my family, or I'll make a few notes here and maybe somebody will publish it locally. And there's an absolute treasure trove of really gritty first-hand accounts, which are a fascinating deep dive into people's own experiences in the Great War. There's a man by the name of Tom Gregory, who's a Hertfordshire guy who famously, well, not famously, in fact, hardly known at all, wrote his experiences in the 1970s when he'd just come back actually from visiting the battlefields with a few mates. And I wonder if he'd sat down over a beer back in Ypres somewhere and some of the lads had said, Tom, you had a really interesting war. Why don't you write it down? And eventually he does, and he writes a really powerful, moving, gritty account. I've referenced it a number of times in the podcast. One thing that sticks in my mind is him describing leading a burial party for a father and son who had been killed from his hometown of Chorley Wood. And I'll paraphrase, but he says something along the lines of, no one reading this could ever plumb the depths of my despair had you not carried two men in two shoeboxes to their grave. And it's things like that. They don't make it into big hitter novels typically, but you could read the emotion on the page and you could feel it when I was reading it. So those for me are extremely powerful. And I like the fact that they're hard to come by. Nobody's really seen them. And you kind of feel, for me at least, I feel almost a personal connection with the author at the time that you're reading. It feels like a personal, almost a diary entry that you're reading. So for me, they're really fascinating. That being said, there's a lot to be said for more generalized histories that can give a really good overview for somebody maybe fairly new to the subject who wants to get in and just understand how things work. I know, Spencer, you've written a number of these yourselves that are maybe pitched more at a slightly higher level than those very general histories. But if somebody's really just wants to get straight into the subject of the Great War, and they want a good baseline to start at to really understand the nuts and bolts, apart from, of course, listening to this podcast, where would you suggest that people go?
Oh, it's a good question. And again, a lot depends on your prior level of knowledge. But I think if you're just starting out and you just want to pick up a short book that gives you the complete overview of the First World War, it is from a British perspective, but at the same time, I think it remains a great starting point. And that would actually be Gary Sheffield's book, Forgotten Victory. And it is very much from a British and by extension, a British Empire perspective. But it was quite revolutionary when it came out in the early 2000s. And it is a short history in itself, but it tries to really take aim at, should we say, the myth which we've addressed, that all the armies were lions led by donkeys, all the fighting was futile, all the losses were meaningless. And at the time, it was quite revolutionary, and it's some decades old now. I think it came out in the early 2000s, but it's a really short book. It's a sharp book, doesn't waste too much time, but it does give a great overview of the war from a British perspective. And I think as a short introduction to the overall war, especially if you're in the English-speaking world, I think this is a great starting point. And even if you don't agree with everything that's in this book, and it certainly has been challenged, it certainly had its revisions, I think it's a great starting place that just gives you an overview about how, particularly the war was seen at the time, which I think we perhaps lost a bit of sight of. So short, easy to pick up, cheap, easy to read as well. I think that's a great starting point for anybody just starting out with this study. And of course, there's a world of books beyond this as well. Not least mine, as you say, Dan, very, very kind of you to mention. I've put together a whole series of books that cover the British Army, and by extension, British Empire forces too, year by year in the First World War. So Stemming the Tide was about 1914, Courage Without Glory, 1915, At All Costs, 1916, and The Darkest Year, 1917. Maybe not best place to start because they are quite academic, they're quite heavyweight, but if you're interested in going a step further with the British Army, well, I hope you might consider picking them up because they're seriously in depth. But that's my suggestion for an opening gambit, for an opening broad book. Is the one that you recommend, Dan? Is the one that inspired you, for example?
Well, there's a number of them, to be honest. I mean, Gary Sheffield's stuff is obviously very, very meticulously done, very readable, very engaging from that point of view. We've actually had a few people who have dipped into this on the dugout when we asked this very question. Hendrik here has put forward Peter Hart's The Great War as an option here. Peter writes some really readable history. He's obviously got a background as the Imperial War Museum's audio guy who basically went around interviewing veterans of the Great War. I've known Peter for a number of years. He famously told me that he was once referred to by a First World War veteran as the idiot with the tape recorder, which I'm sure he won't mind me sharing. But he's actually incredibly engaging and writes very well and has a vast depth of knowledge. So Peter Hart's The Great War would be a great option. There are a number of other ones which, in terms of understanding from a battlefield perspective, are worth considering. Actually, Jay Curry put one forward, which is the ABMC, the American Battlefield Monuments Commission Guide to the Battlefields. Really, really interesting if you want to understand the battlefields, as is the famous Holt's, Major and Mrs. Holt. Sadly, Major Holt passed away a number of months ago now. But their look into the battlefields generally and understanding the battlefields, yeah, absolutely. You've also got things like the famous old Lynn MacDonald's Passchendaele, and you've got a number of others. Depending on which battle you want to dip into, can really offer some interest. From my personal position, it's got to be those first-hand accounts, those memoirs and things like that, of which Andy Stewart suggests Trooper on the Tins by R.A. Lloyd. We've got a number of... Kevin's reading something about the Gurkhas at the moment. We've got Joe Rooney, who's talking about Flesh and Steel by Michael Goya, which I haven't read, actually. I don't know. And then a couple of people have mentioned To the Last Man by Jeff Shara recently, which actually I don't know this book. Is it something that's crossed your path?
Yeah, it's actually I believe it's actually a novel. And
Interesting.
Jeff Shara is a prolific writer of military novels, and he's probably most famous for Gods and Generals, which is about the American Civil War, which was made into a very unsuccessful, but actually not too bad to watch film. And To the Last Man is his only novel that's actually set in the First World War. This is going to sound terrible. I've got a copy that was a gift, and I've never actually got around to reading it. So I can't really comment on it, but he's a prolific author of these type of novels, and I know it's been very popular with some of the readers in the Dugout. So listeners, perhaps that if you're looking for a novel of the First World War, and I know a lot of our Dugout listeners have commented on their interest in novels, because there is still a small but significant market for First World War novels. And they can be a great gateway too. I mean, they can fire the imagination, they can capture the imagination in a way that perhaps a history book doesn't, if you're starting out or if you're looking for something a little lighter. So, yeah, it'd be interesting in any other First World War novel recommendations that you might have, listeners, too. I know that Birdsong's very popular, for example. There's been one or two others. Obviously, my interest in First World War novels is a little older, so I'm interested in the novels of the 20s and 30s, but they're very interesting too. So at some point, we'll have to do a full episode on novels of the First World War, I think, though.
Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were speaking there, in fact, it's outside of the remit of this, but I wonder if the First World War is really ripe for a story of this kind. You could argue that perhaps Henry Williamson, with his Chronicles of Ancient Sunlight, might fall into this category, a really in-depth, powerful series from somebody who was a veteran of the Great War themselves, who doesn't explicitly use himself as the main character, but you can certainly see reflections in what he did. But I know, Spence, you enjoy a series. I think I suggested to you to go back and try it, which is from a much earlier period. But I just wonder if the First World War is missing one of these versions. And I'm talking of the style of, if you like, fact-based fiction, the Sharp series for those who are into the Peninsular War, the Hornblower series for those that are into Peninsular Naval War, or my personal favourite, which is also from the same ilk, which is the Aubrey Maturin series by Patrick O'Brien, which looks the Master and Commander, you might want to call it, series. So, I mean, these things are quite often, they're based loosely around a character. I think there's a good argument that Aubrey and Maturin, or Jack Aubrey and Horatio Hornblower, are both very likely named after a famous admiral by the name of Cochrane, who was a real larger-than-life character. Do you feel, is there anything to your mind that's First World War that kind of can be used as a really good gateway in the same way that the Hornblower or the Maturin series or the Sharp series could be?
Well, I have to say that not anything that I've read. And I think perhaps this is interesting that it's safe enough to set great adventures in the Napoleonic Wars. And Bernard Cornwell, I have to say, I've read all the Sharp books. I've also read his Starbuck books, which are set in the American Civil War, and some of his other materials, the material about the Saxon Wars and stuff. I find it immensely readable, entertaining. It's almost as though I think one of the things that discourages people to perhaps pursue that in the First World War is that the First World War is still shaped by these memories that it was appalling and, wasteful and tragic. And the idea perhaps of putting an adventure into this perhaps hasn't caught fire. Over the years, I have to say, I've had a number of people contact me about they're working on either scripts or perhaps they're working on novels themselves to do in the First World War. And I always, encourage this. Nothing seems to have quite caught fire yet. I think that the overall image perhaps precludes that, which is a shame, because I think there is real opportunity for this type of book. It doesn't have to be set on the Western Front. Think about the almost beyond belief adventures of T. Lawrence of Arabia in the Middle East, for example. Perfect setting, I'd have thought, for a more adventurous novel. Or think about the actions of spies behind the lines. Lots and lots of opportunity there. And in a way, I'm glad you mentioned Chronicles of Ancient Sunlight by Henry Williamson, which is this epic series. I compare it to a War and Peace for the First World War. Absolutely enormous, 15 novels, millions of words, I'm sure. In a way, his books that cover the First World War, which from memory is about books 4 to 9, I think. Each novel's really about a year in the First World War and what happens there. In a way, they're perhaps the closest we have to this, because it does chart a variety of characters through all the intensity of the First World War. Obviously, they're rather different. I mean, they are literary epics, to be quite literal. So there's still a market there. I know there are novelists who contact me. There's scriptwriters who've contacted me who are interested in this. I'd say keep working on these. There's definitely a market, I think, for this type of book or TV series or Netflix series or anything else. I think in a way, it's a gap in the market.
There we go. So a bit of marketing advice for free for you today. So mind you, we do have to move on because otherwise it's going to turn into just a books rather than the Q&A episode. So let's get into a few questions. I'm going to start off. We've got one here from Eric, actually, who asked by the Dugout. What exactly are staff officers and what do they do? An interesting question, Spence, and one I'd imagine has been asked in a trench more than once before now.
Just great point, Dan. And staff officers, well, first of all, the name. You may wonder, listeners, where's the name come from? And it's actually an outgrowth from a much earlier time in war, where there was a difference between an officer, a regimental officer, who would be at the front lines, who would be leading men into battle, and officers who would be around a general, and they would be the general's staff. They do various jobs for him, carry messages, write down orders that he dictated, anything you can think of. And over time, they became simply abbreviated as staff officers to differentiate them from regimental officers or indeed other branches of the army. And so a staff officer is essentially part of the commander's staff team. They're going to be carrying out duties like planning and coordinating, managing operations, intelligence that they will filter through to their commander, administration matters as well. Staff officers don't usually command troops directly, but they're going to support decision-making, and they're going to, in theory at least, if they're working perfectly, staff officers are a filter through which the commander's intentions can be turned into actual formal orders and organization. To put it in a slightly light-hearted way, a commander says, I want that position taken, I want that hill captured, and I want it done with minimal casualties. And then his staff officers will interpret this into plans and orders and directions. It's actually a very demanding job. And traditionally, certainly in European armies from the mid-1800s on, perhaps even earlier, staff officers would be considered an intellectual elite. It's not an easy job to be a staff officer. It requires a lot of mental power, a lot of planning strengths, a lot of ability to translate vague concepts into actionable written orders and so on. So it's a challenging role. A lot of management involved in this. And when it goes wrong, people get killed. And this is one of the tensions in the First World War. When the staff make mistakes, and inevitably they will, disaster often follows for the soldiers. And when we read, and this is true of the British and the German army alike, and the American army, incidentally, when things are going wrong at the front, the food hasn't come up, obviously strange orders have arrived and things aren't working, the staff, who are this sort of invisible force back at headquarters, they're the ones who get blamed. So it's a tough job. It's a thankless job, because when everything goes well, the commander and the fighting troops get the credit. When everything goes badly wrong, it tends to be the staff who get the blame. And difficult job, challenging job, but produces actually some very, very fine minds in the context of the First World War. And perhaps the Germans are most closely associated with this. They've really created the modern image of a staff officer with their training. And a lot of the German efficiency, their ability to pull together fighting groups at the last minute, especially in 1918 when the army is really on its knees, keep its logistics going, keep things moving, is due to its staff systems.
Also quite often distinguished, of course, by the famous red tabs that they wear on their uniforms, and known as red tabs for that reason. This is the kind of Captain Darling character, if you like, your Blackadder that we'll often see. But I think there's a key point that you make there, Spence, as well, in that, of course, not everybody is a permanent staff officer. In fact, quite a number of people are going to go into a staff position because they've been earmarked for higher things. So you might get somebody that's been a good field grade officer, perhaps a major, senior company commander, who has been earmarked for perhaps battalion command. And rather than always go directly to battalion command, it might be that they're seconded to staff for a little while whilst they can find their feet, learn a little bit more of the strategy and the kind of top tier skills required before then taking up a battalion command post. We see things like aide de camp, famously, pre-First World War periods, also still continues through. You get the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo had a very big staff, famously referred to as his family. So it's people doing any number of tasks and jobs. And as you rightly say, some of the blame that's put from the men in the trenches onto the staff it can be pretty powerful stuff. One sticks in mind for me. I think it's September of 1918. There's a young officer and a sergeant who's very highly regarded within a battalion have been given a job of going out into no man's land to check an abandoned British tank. Some staff officer comes along and says, we need to know how much ammunition is in that tank, whether there's anything salvageable. And both men are shot and killed by a sniper in doing so. And the vitriol that is directed at that particular staff officer to his face in the trenches as a result of this job that's been handed out, because presumably somebody's told him to go and arrange for that to happen, is really, really powerful. The staff, I think sometimes, and we have discussed this, I think, before, Spence, this idea of kind of the soldiers' dislike towards generals. I wonder if actually the soldiers' dislike towards staff is actually more of an appropriate thing.
I think it is, and there's a lot of blame is placed on faceless staff officers who, it's often said, they don't understand what's happening at the front line, and partially this is because staff officers aren't often seen by regular soldiers in the front line. It's not really a place for staff, and when they do appear, they're often dismissed as brass hats because their helmets are shiny compared to the regular soldiers who've got dirt, may have added some camouflage to it, and so on and so forth. And in some ways, you can understand why. When things have gone wrong, you need someone to blame, and ultimately lives are often being lost. Needless casualties sustained, and one of the biggest critics of staff officers tend to be regimental officers, especially younger regimental officers, relative juniors. They're leading their men into battle in attacks where things haven't been coordinated properly, things haven't gone correctly, the artillery barrage hasn't done what it's meant to do, or the creeping barrage races off and you can't keep up with it, the barbed wire isn't cut, the intelligence reports are wrong, and that's your men who get killed and wounded as a result. And you can understand if you're a young officer and you've trained your men as best you can, you lead them as bravely as you can, and then the attacks failed because of various errors higher up the chain, you're going to be so frustrated and angry. But one thing I will say is being a staff officer is not necessarily a cushy job, because although the image in the front line is, well, staff officers never come down to see what's going on here, it's not strictly true. And actually, staff officers in all the armies will suffer pretty significant casualties. Hit by artillery bombardments, for example, caught out if their headquarters happens to get identified by enemy reconnaissance and given a drubbing. And there's more staff officers near the front line who get killed and wounded than I think any army really appreciates. So it is by no means a free and cushy job. This image, they're all sat around a drinks cabinet smoking big cigars, is not strictly true. Although their day-to-day life might be more comfortable than a soldier in the trenches, well, it is more comfortable. than a frontline soldier, they still have their dangers that they have to face too. And I think no group in the First World War, and this, as I say, listeners, is true for all the armies, gets more opprobrium than the staff officer. And yet, without good staff work, armies simply cannot function. And so you have to acknowledge their successes and whilst still being critical of their failures.
Yeah, very interesting. And staff officers, I think maybe is something to come back to for a full episode because there's so much more to talk about there. But we've got to press on. So we've got a really interesting question here from Stuart, who says that he's interested in the structure of gallantry awards with specific reference to the British. So he says with the rationalisations in 1993 with crosses for all rank and a single conspicuous gallantry cross at level 2, the MC, the military cross, was reclassified alongside the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Distinguished Service Cross. Question is, what was the level 3 gallantry award for junior officers in the army, etc., etc.? Now that might sound like a bit of a mouthful, but if we break it down, it's actually quite an interesting question. So if you imagine, if you like, a triangle pyramid of sorts in terms of the levels of gallantry awards that can be handed out in the Great War, I think most people, depending on whichever army you're in, most people understand that generally which one's at the top. So if you're a Brit Spence, it's the Victoria Cross. If you're an American, it's the Medal of Honor. If you're in the French army, it's the 5th grade of the Legion d'Honneur. And if you're in the German army, it is, if you're an officer only, the Blue Max in the First World War. But in terms of the Brits, are you aware, Spence, of the kind of how the structure works for both officers and other ranks, or am I best placed to talk about this one?
I think you're best placed to talk about it because this is, as is often the way with honours and awards of the Victorian and Edwardian period, it's actually a bit of a minefield. And there's a lot of nuances and wrinkles. So, Dan, I'm going to throw it over to you for your knowledge on this one.
Well, I definitely don't have an encyclopedic knowledge about it, that's for sure. And it does shift as the war changes. It makes it slightly tricky. But staying at least from the British perspective, at the very top of the tree, you've got the Victoria Cross. It's available to all ranks. Anyone, any private soldier or a general can be awarded the Victoria Cross. You're a little more likely to receive it as an officer. There are 3 people in the history of warfare who've been awarded the double Victoria Cross, with the second award of a medal being referred to in the British circles as Bar. So VC and Bar. 3 people, 2 of them in the First World War, both non-combatants as it happens, both medical doctors. Arthur Martin Leake and Noel Chavasse awarded the VC. And then a New Zealander, Charles Upham, in the Second World War, a combatant, is the 3rd man in history to do that. Now, depending if you're an officer or you're an other rank, so really a warrant officer downwards, you would probably take one of 2 paths at that point. So if you're an officer, it will be the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, that you would receive. The DSO, depending on the time of war, can be harder or perhaps easier to receive. In 1915, a lot of battalion commanders receive a DSO. I don't want to sound disparaging with it. There's an old quirky phrase that people say that it came up with the rations. They're handed out fairly freely in the early part of the war. On the other hand, the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which is awarded for other ranks, is very highly regarded and seen as very difficult to achieve, and you have to do something really seriously impressive in order to get a DCM. Below that, again, staying with the slight split between officers and other ranks, an officer would typically be awarded the Military Cross, the tier below that, the 3rd tier, and then from 1915 only, I believe, you have the Military Medal, both of which are awarded for respective gallantry in the field. So typically, going back to the MC is generally awarded to junior officers, not exclusively, and the DSO is typically awarded to majors and higher. But there are some crossovers. In fact, military crosses can be awarded to regimental sergeant majors and company sergeant majors. The military medal is almost exclusively awarded to junior ranks, privates, lance corporals, and so on. Below that, you also have the MID, the mention in dispatches, which isn't a medal, rather it's an oak leaf that is entitled to be awarded on the ribbon of a specific medal. So the mention in dispatches, and these things come out in different tiers, and actually the military medal, going back up one level, is brought out because the Distinguished Conduct Medal comes with a cash reward as well. That cash reward is paid annually, I believe, and basically the British Army doesn't want to pay out thousands of lots of cash rewards every year, so they offer the military medal in its place, and the MM doesn't come with a cash reward, but does come with a fair amount of prestige associated to it. And yeah, there are people in the Great War who are awarded incredible numbers of medals for bravery. There's one man, perhaps you remember his name for me, Spencer, who's in, I think, in the 46th Division, who is awarded the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Conduct Medal and Bar, and the Military Medal and Bar, at the very least. Possibly he gets more than that. So that's a staggering amount. And what's interesting, actually, if you look at sets of medals, you can, in a sense, chart a man's career as well, because what you might sometimes find is that they're recipient of perhaps the Military Cross and the Military Medal, or the Distinguished Service Order and the Military Medal. And it tells you that at some point they've crossed that divide from other ranks to a commissioned officer, because they've crossed over that boundary. And so you can actually read a little bit about people's careers from that point of view. So absolutely fascinating stuff. In a very roundabout answer to that question, there are effectively in the British Army, there are 2 tiers which go down, and you've got one for other ranks and one for officers. In the 1990s, they basically amalgamate that so that all medals are now available to all ranks, very much like the Victoria Crosses. Same thing applies in the French Army these days. Same thing applies even in the German Army in the Second World War. But in the First World War, the Blue Max, or the Pour le Mérite, which is never actually known as the Blue Max, is awarded only to officers. So you can get an Iron Cross if you're a British, not if you're British, if you're a German infantryman. But that's a little bit on medals. It's just an interesting, kind of fun subject to look at. And of course, depending on the stories associated to medals these days, can be extremely valuable. I recall a Victoria Cross sold for a couple of years ago for about £500,000. So there's a lot of money and a lot of fascinating things attached to these stories. In fact, as a little side note for you here, Spence, I'm currently working on, for our Battle Guide YouTube channel, our latest story, which is on the Battle of Rorke's Drift in 1879. Perhaps the most famous recipient of the Victoria Cross in 1879 is John Chard, who's played in the Zulu film in 1964 by Stanley Baker. Stanley Baker was so proud of the role that he'd played based around John Chard that he ended up buying what he thought was a copy of Chard's actual Victoria Cross, and he kept it for years. It wasn't until perhaps after his death, or very close to his death, that somebody checked and found out he hadn't bought the copy, he'd bought the original, which I think is quite interesting. Anyway, let's move on because there's so much more to cover still. We've got some interesting... Jono sent in a question fairly recently, which I think is particularly interesting, who said, did any conscripts or volunteers move over to the Navy, or perhaps more interesting, wish they had done so during the Great War?
Interesting question. Well, I can certainly give an example of a volunteer who moved, but moved in the opposite direction. And that's actually one of my great-great-uncles on my mother's side of the family. And the 4 brothers, 3 of them actually went to war. The 4th stayed at home and actually died prematurely of a disease, which is unfortunate. The 3 brothers who fought all came back, including my great-grandfather. But the brother of my great-grandfather actually joined the Navy, volunteered for the Navy in 1914. But by 1916, he transferred out of the Navy and he ended up in the 11th Worcestershires and he fought at Salonika, where he got shot in the head, which he may have caused him to regret his decisions. And he survived, though, and would live a long life after the First World War, get married and so forth. But the family story, such as it is that he was bored in the Navy and was looking for opportunity to see action like his 2 other brothers, who were both on the Western Front. So it did happen, and there was an opportunity to do so, especially in the early part of the First World War, because for a time, the Royal Navy was actually overmanned. It had such a huge reserve that there were a lot of reservists who didn't have a ship to go to, didn't have a role to go to, and in fact, a number of them, thousands of them, in fact, would end up in the Royal Naval Division, which is another story for another podcast episode. In terms of moving, once conscription had been brought in, the ability to move, unless you were an officer, became pretty limited. You were either in one or the other. And the army in particular needed men much more urgently than the Navy. Yes, there's casualties in the Navy. Yes, there's manpower demands in the Navy. But because the Royal Navy didn't fight any major action after Jutland 1916, it could really make do with the manpower it had. That it still needed to recycle manpower. People got injured. People left for various reasons. But it was the army that had this. So the ability to move, no, effectively, you're a conscripted soldier. As an officer, possibly. But I'm not aware of any. I'm sure there are some, but I'm not aware of any who went from army to navy, or indeed the other way around. Generally, you'd stick to one branch or another. Of course, there are differences. Sir John French, who commands the British Army 1914 and 1915, he starts his career as a midshipman in the Navy and ends up commanding the British Army for just over a year between 1914 and 15. So there is movement here, but within the context of being a conscript, once you're conscripted, you're generally going to be in one or the other, the Army or the Navy.
Yeah, very interesting. I think perhaps the only possible exception that I can think of here is going to be the RNAS, the Royal Naval Air Service, where you perhaps do get a little bit of movement. Same with the Royal Flying Corps, which later becomes the RAF, up until April, I think. Is it 1st of April, I think, isn't it? 1918? When the Royal Air Forces formed, a number of men just get transferred over from the RFC directly to the RAF. And that link is still perhaps a little easier than it might be. But actual Army to Navy, not so sure. But it's interesting that you mentioned there, Spence, this idea of people not necessarily wanting to move. As I can imagine, many people spoke about it. You can imagine that conversation in the trenches where somebody's knee deep in water thinking, yeah, I'm not really sure the army was the right choice for me. I'm sure there were plenty of tongue-in-cheek comments about that. It's interesting that actually perhaps the most prominent ones are the other way around. There are a number of famous characters. Baron von Richthofen, who ends up in early 1915 as a cavalry officer. He's bored that he's not getting enough action. He's on lines of communication at that point, so he wants to transfer into the Air Force, and so on and so forth. And a number of those famous characters find that they're trying to make a move towards the action rather than away from it, which is just incredible to my mind. Now, we're getting towards the end of this episode, Spencer. I want to touch on one particular film here, which I think is really interesting. GKT mentioned it, actually. I would like to hear your comments on a particular film that really stole the headlines a few years ago. I can tell you now that the title of it absolutely enrages me and is a real bugbear of mine on the battlefield because it's ruined a certain part of commemoration as far as I see it. But I'd love to know what your thoughts are, as with GKT, on the film They Shall Not Grow Old.
Well, it's interesting that many discussions about films. We've never actually tackled this one, and one perhaps to cover in a future podcast. I'll be upfront. I think as a technical achievement, I think this is absolutely phenomenal. The recoloring, the slowing down, of course, of films, so you don't get that unusual, slightly juddery, almost supernatural effect that you have with older film. The capturing of that, the integrating of veterans' voices, I think is brilliantly done. It's unique. There's nobody's been able to do anything quite like it since. There's been attempts. Nothing I think has quite matched it. And when I first saw it, I had a genuine emotional impact on it. It really did sort of affect me because it felt as if you'd been transported into a world that we'd glimpsed, of course, because we have this film. This isn't, new film. It's film that's existed for a long time, but it's always been black and white, and it's always had that juddery effect. And seeing this and seeing some of particularly the soldiers larking about, there's a particular sequence, and listeners, if you've seen it, you'll know it, where there's some Tommies, and one of them's got a captured Pickelhaube on his head, and another's got a captured Stahlhelm, and they're tapping each other's helmets, and they're laughing at the camera. They've obviously got terrible teeth, as was so many British soldiers did in the First World War. And it just, I remember that just captured something because there's clearly a couple of mates mucking about, and you look at it and they could be from a football crowd, having fun or being ridiculous or something. And in actual fact, they're in war. Similarly to some of the footage of wounded men being taken back is really powerful. So I think it's a terrific film, and I'd recommend it to anybody with an interest in the First World War. One thing I will say about Peter Jackson is he's a genuine history buff. He's got one of the biggest collections of First World War aircraft in the world, in fact, in New Zealand. And he's a huge supporter of museums in New Zealand and military history in general. I think it's fantastic, and only somebody with his background and his passion for this subject, I think, could have actually made this work. So I think it's terrific. I'd recommend anybody to watch it. I think it's unlike anything you're going to see. So big fan. And I've seen it multiple times. When I first saw it, it really did have an effect on me. I completely understand your comment about the title, though, Dan. So why don't you just explain that a little bit for our listeners who might not be completely aware?
Yeah, I think it probably does need a bit of explanation, doesn't it? So I'll add to that. Peter Jackson, of course, the famous director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy series, we should say, huge interest in the subject. In fact, I think he has a relative killed at Pond Farm at St Julian during the Passchendaele offensive, which it may well be where his passion for the subject comes from. His work on creating from Geoffrey Malin's original 1916 Somme films and various others where they've been reworked is just second to none in that sense. The title really annoys me because every time I go to Ypres, and I must have been there maybe 100 times as a battlefield guide, perhaps more than that, you get to see these incredible commemorations, which inevitably comes with the reading out of the famous lines. They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old, etc., etc. We all know that very powerful, moving testimony. What has happened recently, though, is probably 9 out of 10 times I hear that now, we see the phrase, they shall not grow old used, which isn't actually the original epitaph. The original line is, they shall grow not old. It's a very geeky problem that I've got. I totally acknowledge that. I can own the fact that I'm really, really being quite picky about this. But it's not the original line. And you see massive international parades and events and all of these kind of things now. And they all make the same mistake of swapping those two words around. They shall not grow old, for they shall grow not old. Don't know why, it always happens, but I go to the last post ceremony in Ypres, and I know every time, sit there with a couple of thousand people around, I know they're going to make that mistake, and I find myself listening for it, and then when it happens, I find myself outraged at it. And I'm sure some of the, I look around thinking, come on guys, we can do better than that. I don't know, am I being super picky here and just a bit weird?
I don't think so. And I think one of the things, and you've been to Ypres even more than I have, but there is, I think there's a certain, dare I say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the exact phrase here, but there's certain phrases I think you don't put on films, and they shall not grow old, I think is one of them. So I completely understand this because it has led to a certain degree of confusion, certain degree of misunderstanding. I suppose one thing we can say is at least there's battlefield guides such as you around to correct anybody who's got that misapprehension.
Well, yeah, got to be there for some decent reason, haven't I? Actually, let's stay with that very subject because Ethan has sent in a question which I think might serve us quite well to round off this episode. He's asking, do you have any advice on sites to visit around Ypres, the Somme, and we'll throw in for special mention Dunkirk as a Second World War option?
Oh gosh, where do we start? I'm going to start by saying that the beauty of Ypres is you can actually study within very easy distance of Ypres. You can study so many battles. You can study 4 major battles: First Ypres, Second Ypres, Third Ypres, and the Battle of the Lys, which is sometimes called the Fourth Battle of Ypres. So lots to see, but listeners, regular listeners in particular, got a huge affection for the Army of 1914, the Old Contemptibles and what they do. And perhaps the greatest military achievement the Old Contemptibles actually have is at First Ypres during the retaking of Gellivelt. And Gellivelt Chateau is the actual starting point for that incredible attack that throws back the Germans really from the cusp of a complete victory at the First Battle of Ypres, the Second Worcester's greatest military achievement, and a story that's almost so remarkable it's beyond belief. We should really cover this in an entire episode. But Gellivelt Chateau is destroyed in the war; it's completely annihilated. But it's then rebuilt exactly as it was before the First World War, or near as exactly. So it looks very much as it did on the 31st of October 1914, when the Second Worcesters counterattacked there to relieve the first South Wales borderers who were clinging on in the chateau, being besieged by the Germans who were breaking through the line. And you can go there and you actually see it. And if you're lucky, the gates will actually be open and you can walk around the grounds. Obviously, treat it with respect. It's a private property. The fact that the gates are open is not an invitation for you to muck around in the flower beds, but I think it's a fantastic place. And even though it's not the original building, the fact it looks exactly like the original building, it's just absolutely so evocative of the history. And you can imagine the Worcesters bursting in through the tree line here, turning the tide of battle. I think it's an absolute must for anybody at Ypres. And a lot of people who visit Ypres naturally focus on the Passchendaele, the Third Ypres campaign and so forth. Passchendaele, completely understand that. Or they want to go and see Vancouver Corner and things for the Canadians at Second Ypres. But don't miss out on Gellivelt Chateau. It's a highlight for me of any tour of Ypres. But what about you, Dan? Where's your first port of call at Ypres?
That's a good question, actually. And I was thinking as you were talking just there about what would be the must see. If you're only going once, I think Tynecott Cemetery, it has to be a must see. It's the largest British military cemetery anywhere in the world, something like 12,200 graves with a number 35,000 missing, all named on a memorial to the missing, to the north end of the cemetery. It kind of looks down from the Broodsinge Ridge down in towards Ypres itself, so it's very well placed. And you can get, I think, a real sense of scale of the Third Battle of Ypres from that location. So that would certainly be one of them. The one personally for me in the Ypres salient would be the battlefield of St Julian, where the Hertfordshire Regiment make their assault on the 31st July 1917, go over the top that morning with about 620 men and 20 officers, and 2 hours later and have 0 officers and 25% of their men able to come out of the line. So it's one of many examples. I was very proud to be able to unveil a memorial there a few years ago to the lads, actually on the 100th anniversary of the day of the attack itself. So that sticks in my mind from a personal perspective. But it's one of so many stories out there. There are literally hundreds of such stories from all across the Great War. But of course, Ypres isn't the only place. And, Spence, I know you and I have been down to the Somme a number of times. And the question that we got here was, where in the Somme? So is there anywhere that sticks in your mind from that point of view as well?
Oh, gosh. For me, and this is purely personally, I think Thiepval is just absolutely stunning. It's a remarkable memorial, described, in fact, as an enigmatic memorial at the time when it was unveiled, because it's, in many ways, it's an uncompromising memorial. And I know there is, of course, the Men in Gate at Ypres, which is another must-see, but there's something about just the scale of Thiepval and its beauty as well. And in a way, its isolation, the fact that it is, unlike the Men in Gate, which is, of course, part of Ypres, Thiepval is a little away from anywhere. Yes, the visitor centre and so forth, but walking through the corridors of the Thiepval Memorial, I just think is a profound experience and a moving experience every time I visit, and just seeing these thousands, these tens of thousands of names, it never fails to affect me. And I know we covered the Somme in an earlier episode, and we talked about, the extent to which this can be considered an Allied victory, albeit a very costly one. And then you can look at this and analyze it dispassionately, and then you walk around Thiepval and you think, well, was it worth the cost of all these names? And I just think it's a incredibly affecting place, and first port of call, I think, for any visit on the Somme. But of course, there's so much to visit on the Somme, Dan. I mean, there's multiple phases of the battle beyond the first day and so forth. But where's your first port of call when you take a group there?
I think typically because of the way, usually, at least being a Brit, you enter the battlefields, which is usually from the north. Possibly my first port of call. And I think one of the most powerful places to really understand the story is a place that's known as the Sunken Lane, should be perhaps known best as the Sunken Road, which is just to the north of a place called Beaumont-Hamel, in the northern part of the British part of the front line. It's the location from which on the 1st of July 1916, men of the 1st Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers are going to go over the top. They've actually snuck out kind of midway across no man's land during the night, and 2 companies are going to attack from a sunken road which runs through no man's land to try and make it into the German positions. And I think the thing that I find really fascinating about the location is you can stand in that spot, you can see where the German trench is, you can see where the Brits are, you can see, the various lumps and bumps in the hills, you can figure out, you can literally stand there and understand the battlefield, you can see the problem. And that I find really interesting in terms of its kind of visual. It's visually appropriate to really set the scene for the Battle of the Somme as a whole. The idea of the race to the parapet can really be understood very clearly from that location. Sadly, it ends up in tragedy, something like 86% casualties for that battalion on that morning, most of which are suffered in the space of about 10 minutes. So, another one of those brutal examples of the first day of the Somme. But there are loads and loads of them. There are some really remarkable, perhaps the most spectacular site on the Somme's got to be Lochnagar Crater, which is the scene of a mine explosion of something like 85,000 pounds of ammonite, which just gouges an enormous hole out of the earth, which is still there, something like 100 meters circumference all these years later. So absolutely enormous. But we've got to steer away from the First War just to answer the final part of this question very briefly. And I know, Spence, you and I have been to and guided a tour together around Dunkirk with a group a couple of years back. Is there anything either on the road to Dunkirk, the route back, or in Dunkirk itself that you would add for anyone visiting that area?
Oh gosh, again, lots and lots to choose from here as well. And I think some of the rearguard actions that go off behind Dunkirk, some miles behind Dunkirk, are phenomenal to take a look at and almost completely forgotten. But for me, and I compared this actually to the D-Day beaches, I think, although in a way, the nature of the beach at Dunkirk is different to the D-Day beaches. There's something very evocative about standing at the water's edge on at low tide on Omaha and looking up at those cliffs and thinking, good grief, imagine storming this. I find, and maybe this is just me, but I find actually just taking some time on the beach at Dunkirk, and of course it's changed dramatically. The Dunkirk working port, as it was in 1940, of course. Bit of a tough town. It's not necessarily, the most luxurious location. It's a working town. But I think just standing on the beach and just looking out and just thinking and just kind of put yourself in the position of British soldiers trapped here waiting. And the famous photographs, recreated, of course, in Christopher Nolan's film Dunkirk, are just lines of soldiers waiting either along the mole or on the beaches. I'm trying to put yourself in that picture, looking out over the grey English Channel, especially if it's a greyish day, because the early part of the Dunkirk evacuation, it was cloudy, it was grey. I find just really evocative, and just spending a few minutes, sometimes with a group, just quietly and just thinking, imagine this. I find it very affecting. Not necessarily an aspect of the battlefield tour, but I think it's an essential thing to do whenever you're on the road to Dunkirk. But what about you, Dan? What's your go-to there?
I'd say a little bit further up the coast. Same thing, really, actually. This idea of being on the beach is very, very powerful. If you get your timing right and you go up the coast to the northern part of the Dunkirk evacuation area, which is actually stretches over a number of miles, it's a place called Bray Dunes. And at Bray Dunes, if you manage to catch it at low tide, or if you're ever in that area and you plan to go to low tide, you can walk out perhaps about 100 meters out towards the sea, and you'll see the remains of a ship called the MV Crested Eagle, which are still sticking out of the sand today, slowly rotting away. That's one of the ships that leaves the Eastern Mole, as something like 60-odd% of all of those that leave Dunkirk will do, and start to begin their journey back to the UK. I believe it's hit by a Stuka dive bomber, set ablaze, and the captain steers the Crested Eagle up onto the beach at Bray Dunes in order to try and save some of the lads in it. There was something like at least a couple of hundred guys killed, actually, in the burning of the Crested Eagle. A really brutal episode. But to see that every low tide slowly emerge out of the sea and to kind of see the remains of one of the ships that was lost there in 1940 is a very powerful thing. In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, there was a French soldier who was discovered under the remains from the shifting sands only a couple of years ago. So, the sea is still giving up its secrets around there. In fact, the beach itself, I found part of a British soldier's boot and a British soldier's gas mask last time I was at the beach there in the dunes. There's still lots of stuff to be seen, but the whole Dunkirk area is amazing. Cassel, famous hilltop defence, the Cresswell bunker, Vermouth massacre site, the Le Paradis massacre site, all of those areas around the 1914 battlefields definitely repay a visit. So we've unusually, I think, Spence, gone away from the First World War for a bit and waxed lyrical about the Second World War. But it does bring us to the end of this episode here. I always love these Q&As. What have we got coming up in the near future, though?
So we're still continuing our journey with the French army on the Western Front with our guest, James Taub, which I know from feedback has been very popular. Always important to remember the French contribution to the First World War, and then the French army's experience, which is so brutal, so hard, even in the context of a grueling war on the Western Front. So looking forward to continuing that. And of course, 2025 moves on. We're moving through anniversaries, in fact. It's been 110 years since 1915. And from a British, and by extension, a British Empire or Commonwealth perspective, campaign that dominates the mind of 1915 is, of course, the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. And it's one of our most requested topics to cover. We get a lot of emails and comments saying, when are you going to do Gallipoli? Or we'd love to see you do Gallipoli, etc., etc. Well, we're finally going to get round to doing it this year in time for the anniversary. And Dan, it's one I'm really looking forward to, and I know you are too.
Yeah, can't wait. There's so many things that we've got to cover. Gallipoli, I'll be in Gallipoli this April, so really looking forward to exploring the battlefields and hopefully have a kind of fresh set of eyes when we get back so they can really get stuck into that campaign. So really exciting future ahead. Thank you, as always, for all of you joining us and for your continued support. If you haven't already, do check out the Dugout over on our new space, if you like, where people can have great conversations. You can access ad-free episodes of the podcast. You can also, if you haven't done already, get a month's free membership as a captain just to check it out, see if you like it, and if you don't like it, no worries. But if you do want to check it out, we'd love to see you over there. There's some really great content and a fantastic community too. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. So here we are. Just want to say a quick thank you once again for taking the time. Normally, you've made it right to the end here, and we just want to know, because we're always wondering how far people make it through the podcast. So do you make it all the way to the usual outtakes that are in this position? If you did, please just do us a favor, drop a quick message into the comments from whatever platform you're watching saying, I made it. We'd love to know how many people make it this far.
This week, we take on one of our periodical dives into the many questions and comments you have shared with us in previous weeks. Is it periodical?
I'm not sure. That's why I left that question mark in.
I think it's actually periodic. Yeah, it's periodic, not periodical.
Okay,
I'll do that again. See, we've got to get the grammar right.
Yeah, got to do it.
Otherwise, someone will tell us in the comments. Okay.